Hey guys, welcome to DIY Crafts. In this video, I am going to show you a step-by-step pattern of making this puff stitch beanie which suits everyone irrespective of age and gender. So let's get started. For this, I am using a 4-ply yarn and a crochet hook of size 3 mm. However, you can use your favorite yarn and its suitable hook size. Now begin with a slip knot and make chain 6. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and finally the 6th one. Now into the first stitch, make a slip stitch to form a round. Now we are going to work our first row into this center. Now chain 2 and let's start making the first puff stitch into the center. For this, yarn over and drop a loop up to the height of this chain 2 and yarn over again and drop another loop from the center and repeat this for another time. Now yarn over and draw through all the loops on the hook. Now make chain 1 and this is your puff stitch. Now make chain 2 to give the chain 2 gap in between the puff stitches. Now into the center we are going to make another puff stitch. Yarn over, include the tail end while working on the second puff stitch. Now while pulling out the second loop, just remember to pull out exactly to the length of the previous puff instead of pulling it to the complete length. Now yarn over and drop second loop. Again the third one, yarn over and make the fourth one. Now we have 8 plus 1 9 loops on the hook. Previously for the puff stitch we have chain 2 which counts as a first stitch. So for this second puff we have done 4 times. Now yarn over and draw the yarn through all the loops on the hook. Now chain 1 and this completes the second puff. Now chain 2. This gives the chain 2 gap. And then let's start making the third puff stitch into the center. For this, yarn over and we are making a puff stitch of 4 loops again. So drop a loop up to the height of the previous puff stitch. That's the second one, third and then the fourth loop. Now yarn over and draw the needle through all the loops on the hook and chain 1 to complete the third puff stitch. Again chain 2 to give the chain 2 space. This completes 3 puff stitches into the center. Continue to make until you have 6 puff stitches in the center. Now make the last chain 2 and make a slip stitch onto the top of the first puff stitch. This completes your row 1 and in your row 1 we will have 6 puff stitches. Now make a slip stitch into the chain 2 space. Let's start making round 2. For this, again begin with chain 2 and make a puff stitch with 3 loops. That's first loop, second loop and the third loop. The first chain 2 counts as the first loop, so we will have 4 loops. Again puff stitch, chain 2 and make another puff stitch into the same chain 2 gap. That's the second loop, third loop and the fourth loop. Now complete your puff stitch and then make chain 2. Now if you notice we have 2 puff stitches in one chain 2 gap, which means this is a puff stitch increase. Now again in the next chain 2 space we are going to make another puff stitch increase. We are going to skip the previous puff stitch and make a puff stitch increase in chain 2 space. So again a puff stitch with 4 loops. Draw through all the loops and complete the puff stitch. Then make chain 2 and make another puff stitch into the same chain 2 space. Just check the height of a puff. Every time you drop a loop, it should be of equal height. Now this completes a puff stitch increase in second chain 2 gap. Likewise, make puff stitch increases in each and every chain 2 space throughout the row with a chain 2 gap in between until you reach the starting point. Now making the last puff stitch in the last chain 2 space, third loop and then the fourth loop. Complete the puff stitch and then make the final chain 2 and make a slip stitch into the top of first puff stitch, and then make a slip stitch into the next chain 2 space, and this completes your second row with 12 puff stitches. The detailed written pattern is given in the description to check it out. Now we are going to start the third row. So we have made first puff stitch in first chain 2 space, then chain 2, and in the next chain 2 space make a puff stitch increase, that is 2 puff stitches worked into the same chain 2 space. That's the first puff stitch. Then make chain 2 and make another puff stitch into the same chain 2 space. That's the second puff stitch. Now we are going to repeat this pattern of 1 puff stitch in the first stitch and puff stitch increase in the next stitch throughout the row. 1 puff stitch and an increase. Then continue with another puff stitch and increase throughout the row. So here I am making the last puff stitch increase in the last chain 2 space. Then complete the puff stitch. Now make the last chain 2 and then make a slip stitch onto the top of the first puff stitch in your third row. So by the end of the third row we will have 18 puff stitches. So this is how it looks like after completing 3 rows of puff stitch. Now let's continue making the 4th round just like previously. Chain 2 and begin with a puff stitch into the first chain 2 space. After completing the puff stitch, make chain 2 and make second puff stitch into the next chain 2 space. Now chain 1 to secure the puff stitch and then chain 2. Now we have 2 puff stitches in first 2 stitches. Now in the next chain 2 space we are going to make a puff stitch increase. That's puff stitch, chain 2 and 1 more puff stitch into the same chain 2 space. Now continue this pattern of 2 puff stitches and puff stitch increase separated by chain 2 throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Now after completing the last puff stitch, make chain 2 and make a slip stitch into the next chain 2 space. This completes 4 rounds. Now chain 2 and let's start making the 5th row. Make first puff stitch into the first chain 2 space. Chain 2 and make second puff stitch in the next chain 2 space. Again chain 2 and the third puff stitch in the next chain 2 space, which means we have 3 puff stitches in first 3 chain 2 gaps, and then in the next chain 2 space we are going to make a puff stitch increase with a chain 2 gap in between. That's a chain 2 and making the last second puff stitch, the puff stitch increase into the same chain 2 space. Now repeat this 3 puff stitches and puff stitch increase throughout the row until you reach the starting point. After making the last puff stitch increase, chain 2 and then make a slip stitch onto the top of the first puff stitch, and this completes the 5th row. I am just stopping it here to check the length of the crown, to check whether it meets my requirement or not. As I am making it for a 1-year-old, 5-inch crown is good enough. So to my measurement I have got 5 inches crown length. If you are making it of a bigger size, you can go and check out the description for the bigger size. The instructions were given there. Now instead of increasing the crown length, I am going to add the height for the cap. And just remain this beginning end as it is already weaved in while working the first row. Now without adding any puff stitch increases, we are just going to make 1 puff stitch in each and every chain 2 gap. Now slip stitch into the next chain 2 space. Make the first puff stitch into the first chain 2 gap. Now chain 2 And keep on adding one puff stitch in each and every chain 2 gap throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So now that I have completed the last puff stitch, and with the chain 2, make a slip stitch onto the top of the first stitch and make another slip stitch into the chain 2 space. Now from the next row, instead of giving a chain 2 space, I am going to just give a chain 1 space to make the cap little bit closer and with a good shape and texture. Now keep on adding the rows until you reach the desired length, the height of the cap. Now so here I have done the last puff stitch, chain 1, and then make a slip stitch into the first stitch. Now make a slip stitch into the next chain 2 space. So this is my cap after making 12 rows. Now let me check the height of the cap. So this is nearly 5.5 inches. So I wanted to make it of 6.5 inches, which is 1 inch lesser than the required height. So here, instead of adding more puff stitch rows, I am going to add a single stitch border to it. So for this, chain 1 and make 2 single stitches into the chain 2 space and 1 single stitch over the puff stitch. Again 2 single stitches in chain 2 gap and 1 single stitch over the puff stitch. Likewise, continue throughout the row until you reach the starting point. If you feel this single stitch border is little bit loose on your head, what you can do is make just 1 single stitch in the chain 1 gap and 1 single stitch on the puff stitch. So it will give you a little bit tighter texture for your head. Now this completes the first row of single stitch border, chain 1, and continue to make 1 single stitch in each and every stitch throughout the row. Just make 1 single stitch in each and every row throughout until you reach the starting point, and likewise add few rows to give the border for your cap. Here I am making the last single stitch and then make a slip stitch into the first stitch, and this gives a nice single stitch border for my beanie. You can see how the texture it is. It's looking so great and it's so cute. Now before we trim the excess thread, just to make sure that we have enough height, checking out the height once again with my measuring tape. I have 6.5 inches, which will be the perfect according to the measurement chart for 1-year-old kid. So now I'm going to chain 1 and trim the excess thread to form a knot. Now weave in this end and our puff stitch beanie is ready. I'm weaving it in with the help of a yarn needle. Just pass the needle through few nearby stitches and trim the excess thread close to the cap. Now you can decorate this beanie with a pom-pom or with a flower applique or a motif, and here I am attaching this beautiful 3D flower to my cap. Reference video for this 3D flower is given in the description. Do check it out. And that's it. A beautiful textured cap with a puff stitch is ready. I hope you all enjoyed watching this tutorial. Do give this pattern a try and let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. See you all in the next video. Thank you for watching. Please like the video, share it and subscribe to DIY Crafts.